The first snow that stayed came early that year, before the last of the larches had finished going gold. By then, I already knew which house would still be shining after the others had gone dark. You could see it from almost anywhere in the village if you knew where to look, up on the eastern bench above the school, past the line of black spruce and the half-collapsed deer fence, a long, low house with a steep slate roof and 6 front windows. In November, when dusk arrived at 4, and the basin filled with blue shadow, most people lit one room and left the rest of the house to the cold. They were careful with power even before there was much reason to be. Mountain people generally are. Light costs something up there. So does heat. You learn to use only what you can defend. That house was different. The front room came on first, then the kitchen, then the small room over the mudroom, and after that, the lamps in the upstairs hall. Not all at once. The sequence was almost domestic in a way I liked. Someone moving through the evening, someone still doing ordinary things. By January, it had become the last thing I checked before I banked my own stove for the night. That winter gets told now, when people tell it at all, as if it began with the road closing or the first radio bulletin people took seriously, or the day we stopped using the church bell except for fire. But for me, it began in September, with dry needles in the gutters and the smell of old soot inside houses that had been shut up all summer. I was there because of chimneys. That sounds narrower than it was. I worked on solid fuel heating systems then, mostly older masonry stoves, steel flues, inserts people had installed badly in the 90s, things like that. I wasn't a full mason in the old world sense. I could lay fire brick and rebuild a throat, recut a smoke shelf, hang and brace Class A pipe, reline a failing chimney, and tell you why a stove smoked only when the wind came from one certain saddle. Mostly I spent autumn driving around mountain towns, trying to make other people's heat dependable before the snow made every small defect feel personal. The co-op in that village had put together a winterization grant after 2 bad cold snaps and 1 house fire the year before. Most of the homes up there had some mix of old wood heat, electric baseboards, and improvised fixes layered over decades. Summer people had bought a few of the chalets and treated them like photographs, then sold them again when they learned what deep winter actually cost. The year-round residents were practical. Their houses worked, mostly. But mostly is not a standard you want around flue gases or roof ice. A man named Tomas called me in August and asked how many weeks I could give them before snow. I told him 6 if the jobs were clustered and somebody had a room I could rent. He said 8 if I was willing to be sensible about expectations and unreasonable about weather. I had just come off a long job outside Sandpoint and had no urgent reason to get back. My apartment lease had ended in June. My ex-wife had remarried the previous spring, and the shop I subcontracted through was happy to keep sending invoices as long as I kept answering my phone. There are periods in life when being useful in a place you don't belong feels easier than deciding where you actually live. At 39, I was in one of those, so I drove up in the 3rd week of September with brushes, rods, refractory mix, gasket rope, a stack of invoices on a clipboard, and enough clothes for cold mornings and early dark. The village sat in a high basin at the end of a road that narrowed from 2 lanes to 1, and then seemed to reconsider whether roads were worth the trouble at all. It wasn't a ski town, though there had been plans for one once. You could still see the concrete pads where a lift station had been started and abandoned. It had been a mining settlement before that, then a summer place, then something quieter and more honest. A year-round Alpine community with 1 store, a school with fewer than 20 students, a clinic room attached to the old municipal hall, a volunteer fire shed, and about 60 people if you counted correctly, and didn't include the cabins that only showed signs of life at Christmas. The first thing I noticed was the light. Not artificial light. The way the basin held daylight longer on one side than the other. Mornings came down the western slope in clear bands. Evenings climbed the east in reverse, the shadows rising house by house until only the upper bench stayed bright. You could stand in the co-op parking lot and watch sunset become geography. The second thing I noticed was that the place had already begun preparing for winter in ways that towns lower down no longer really know how to do. Not talking about it, doing it. Stack after stack of split fir under corrugated roofs, window putty drying on porch tables, canned peaches carried down to root cellars, chains hung on nails where you could grab them in the dark, the bakery reducing hours, not from caution, but from arithmetic. Less traffic, fewer loaves, shorter days. Even the children walked like they were conserving heat. I rented a room over the store from May Dorr, who ran the register 3 days a week and baked on the others. She was one of those lean, weather-finished women who always seemed to have just come in from somewhere practical. She showed me the room, which had a sloped ceiling, a wash basin, and a narrow bed under a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. There was a little cast-iron stove in the corner, with mica windows on the door and a cracked enamel kettle on top. "You'll want to open the damper slower than you think," she said. "It likes to prove a point." "Every stove does," I told her. That got a smile. The jobs were stacked by root and urgency. I worked from a typed list Tomas had made with notes in the margin from 3 different people. Schoolhouse flu draft inconsistent in shoulder season. East cabin at crawl place. Smoke smell in upstairs room. Hall chimney cap missing after wind. Rain's house on upper bench. Parlor stove not drawing. Ask for Helen before entering. Dog is old and deaf. I started at the school, then the hall, then 2 cabins that belonged to a retired couple who only used 1 room all winter and kept the rest closed behind heavy curtains. Every house taught me something about the people in it. Some homes had been arranged around heat as if it were religion. Others treated it like a troublesome relative, necessary, expensive, best handled with a certain resignation. I liked the work because it rewarded attention without requiring much self-disclosure. People talk to you when you're repairing the thing that stands between them and a cold night. Not in a confessional way. More like weather reports mixed with family history. This crack appeared after Easter. My husband always said that pipe was too light gauge. The upstairs gets a sour smell if the snow comes wet. We don't use that room anymore. My daughter used to sleep there when the roads were still good in winter. Nobody really asks anything back of you except competence, and maybe whether you'll take coffee. The Rains house was my 7th job. It sat above the village on a flattened shelf of land that had probably once been a pasture, though by then it was mostly coarse grass, chokecherry, and the remnants of a kitchen garden gone woody with neglect. The house had good bones. Stone lower walls, timber above, deep eaves, slate roof weighted against wind. There was a detached woodshed, a greenhouse with 3 broken panes patched in clear plastic, and an orchard running downhill in tired rows. The dog, as advertised, was old and deaf and asleep under the porch bench when I pulled up. Helen Rains answered my knock with her cardigan buttoned wrong and a carpenter's pencil tucked into her hair. She was in her late 60s maybe, though mountain weather has a way of making people look both older and more durable. "You're the chimney man," she said. "That's me." "I thought you'd be older." "I get that sometimes." "No, I mean for this kind of work." She stepped aside. "Come in, before the heat gets ideas." The stove was a ceramic-faced parlor model from the early 80s. Not beautiful, but solid, tied into an older flue that had been altered more than once. It had been smoking back in low-pressure weather and leaving a dusty smell in the sitting room. Their son had cleaned it in spring, But the problem was higher up. Outside, I found a partial collapse in the liner just below the cap, where freeze-thaw had widened an old fracture. Repairable, but messy. While I was laying tools on a drop cloth, Helen brought coffee and stood watching with the interest some people reserve for surgery. "You're here for the season?" she asked. "Through first real snow, probably." "First real snow is not the same as the first snow that stays." "No," I said. "I've heard." Her husband Paul came in from outside around noon carrying kindling in a milk crate. He had a mechanic's hands, square fingers, dark nails even when clean, and a way of moving that told me his knees hurt, but he didn't consider that a topic. He nodded at me, set the crate down, and went to the sink. "We should do the mudroom stove too," Helen told him. "We'll do it if he's got time." "You don't want to wait until November." "We never wait until November." They had the kind of conversation couples have when they've been sparring over the same practical question for 30 years and have long since filed the sharp edges off it. I liked being around that sort of thing. It made houses feel occupied in the deeper sense. I repaired the liner, reset the cap, sealed 2 hairline joints in the stovepipe, and showed Paul where someone had used the wrong screws on a collar years back. Before I left, Helen asked if I could come back to look at the mudroom heater and maybe advise on lamp oil storage. "Lamp oil?" "For winter," she said. "I bought more than usual." I told her I could. On the drive back down, I noticed their upstairs curtains. Thin white cotton, not thermal drapes like most people used. They let the light through in a soft square even in late afternoon. After a week, I had a rhythm. Up at 6, open the stove, kettle on. Notes from May if anyone had come by while I was asleep. Drive the day's road with a thermos between my knees and the clipboard on the passenger seat. Work until the light flattened. Sometimes eat at the co-op table in back if there was stew. Sometimes take a sandwich up to the room and listen to the pipes cool. Autumn there was brief but not rushed. The village had a way of accepting the season without narrating it. The aspens thinned. The grass dulled. One morning the creek along the road wore a skin of ice in the shadows and nobody commented. Tourists, such as they were, went home early that year. A hunting party from Boise checked out of the lodge after one night because their phones weren't getting enough signal, and the wife of one of them had seen something on television that made her uneasy. A delivery truck arrived with half the order missing and no explanation. The gas station down in Talcott limited purchases. People mentioned these things in the tone usually reserved for barometric pressure. The first truly odd note reached us through a battery radio on the shelf behind the co-op register. It was a regional bulletin phrased so cautiously you could tell nobody at the state level wanted to be the first person to sound foolish. There had been multiple incidents of public disturbance associated with acute neurological presentation. Residents were asked to avoid unnecessary travel to county emergency departments and to remain in contact with local authorities. There was something about caregiver fatigue and staffing shortages. Then static. Then farm prices. May turned the volume down and kept weighing flour. "Neurological presentation," she said. "That's one way to put things," Tomas replied from the coffee grinder. I was there for that because I'd come down to buy more stove cement and a dozen D batteries. People went on with what they were doing. But they listened differently after that. You can hear it in a room when attention doesn't leave with the words. A day later, I drove past 3 ambulances on the lower road heading toward the valley. No lights, just moving fast. The driver in the last one had a window down in cold air and looked gray with tiredness. 2 mornings after that, the school closed for cleaning, which in a village that size meant the teacher wanted to keep children home until somebody decided what was actually happening. Nora Shine, The nurse practitioner, who used the clinic room 3 days a week, started sleeping in the hall office so people wouldn't pound on her door at all hours. Still, nothing in the basin itself felt like panic. That is one of the things I remember most clearly. Not courage exactly, not denial either. Just a mountain community applying the same quiet triage it applied to weather, road washouts, and bad hay years. What do we know? What do we have? Who needs what first? Which problem belongs to us and which only passes through? I kept working because people still needed heat, and if anything, the work picked up. Houses that had treated the backup stove as decorative suddenly wanted it cleaned and tested. The school asked if I could make the old kitchen range safe enough to use if the power dropped. Tomas and I spent a full day at the hall, moving an old barrel of dry fuel pellets and checking the backup generator, though that wasn't really my field. People with electric baseboards asked how much wood they would need to get through November if the line went down. The answer was always more than they wanted to hear. I went back to the Rains house in the second week of October. Helen had laid newspapers under the mudroom stove and cleared a space for me. The dog was asleep again, in almost the same place. The house smelled like apples going soft in a bowl, and wool drying near heat. The mudroom heater was simpler than the parlor stove, just badly neglected. While I worked, Helen sorted jars at the table and asked me questions that sounded casual until I noticed they were mostly about winter. How long can lamp oil keep if it doesn't freeze? Would a cracked window on the north side matter if the room stayed shut? Is it worth insulating the attic hatch if you only lose heat at night? Do people really get carbon monoxide sleepy enough not to wake up? I answered as best I could. Something in the valley? I asked finally. Something everywhere, eventually, she said. Paul came in around lunch with their son Aaron, who I recognized only because Helen had mentioned him. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, broad-shouldered and a little stooped in the way mechanics sometimes are from always working toward the thing in front of them. He shook my hand and asked what he owed me for the last job. "Your mother already settled it," I said. "She always does that. She says you cleaned the stove in spring. I did a half job. You did better than a lot of full ones." That made him laugh once through his nose. He stayed while I tested the draw and ended up helping me reseat a warped baffle plate. He had good hands for tools, not flashy, just attentive, the sort of person who hands you the right wrench before you ask for it. When we stepped outside, he stood on the porch looking down over the basin. "You from around here?" he asked. "Not around here, no. You should leave before November if you can." Professional advice? Amateur, unfortunately. He said it lightly, but not enough for it to be a joke. I looked at him then. Tired eyes. Stubble. He'd been driving the valley routes for parts and supplies, Helen said later, helping people get things before the stores got strange. Strange was the word people used then for almost everything because it kept the shape of reality soft enough to handle. "Roads?" I asked. "Roads, people, hours." He shrugged. "Town feels wrong after dark." I wanted to ask in what way, but Helen came out with a carton of preserves for me to take back to May, and the moment moved on. I didn't leave before November. Part of that was practical. By the time I might have gone, there were fuel lines down valley and 2 closures on the highway due to wrecks no one could explain cleanly. Part of it was that Tomas asked if I'd stay on for winter retainer if the village pooled payment and room. "Not full-time," he said. "Just if things go thin. We could use somebody who knows heat." But part of it, if I'm honest, was simpler and less admirable. I had settled into the shape of the place. I liked that days were measurable by tasks. I liked that when I solved a problem, it stayed solved at least until weather found a new angle. I liked watching the first frost hold in the grass above the creek until noon. I liked being useful in ways that did not require a speech. The first time I saw one of the dead, though we weren't calling them that yet, I was driving back from the Upper Ridge cabins with a box of cracked fire brick rattling in the bed. There had been freezing rain overnight. The road below the quarry ran black and slick through spruce. Around a bend, I found a compact sedan, half off the shoulder against a berm, front tire spinning slowly in open air. The engine wasn't running. The driver's door stood open. About 30 yards down slope, a woman in a maroon coat was walking into the trees without apparent urgency. I stopped and called out because that is what you do. She didn't look back. I tried again, louder. She kept moving. There was something wrong about the gait. Not dramatic, just uncoordinated and stubbornly level, as if whatever told the body to favor an ankle or turn at a voice had stopped reporting for work. I remember standing with one hand on the open truck door and not yet understanding why the hair had gone cold on the back of my neck. Then I saw blood on the inside of the car door. Not much. Smears where a hand had slipped. I got back in the truck, reversed carefully around the bend, and drove straight to the hall. By then, enough had reached us through radio and rumor that nobody made me explain why I hadn't tried to help her. Nora only asked where exactly I'd seen the car, and whether the woman had looked injured or purposeful. "I don't know," I said. "She looked busy." That was the truest word I had. After that, caution stopped feeling theoretical. It didn't become chaos. I want to be clear about that. The village didn't erupt into panic, or barricades, or those movie versions of social collapse that mostly seem to involve everyone forgetting how doors work. What happened instead was more tiring. People narrowed their movements. They canceled the weekly shuttle to Talcott. The school shifted lessons to 3 mornings a week, with children dropped one family at a time. The hall kept a board by the entrance listing who had radio contact, who had fuel to spare, who needed insulin, who could still drive the switchbacks in weather. Nora put up written guidance about bites and fevers and not attempting transport after dark unless bleeding was active. Tomas and 2 others patrolled the lower road at dusk, not because they had a plan, exactly, but because unobserved problems tend to grow. The church bell remained silent. That had been agreed on quickly. Too many false reasons for someone to come toward sound. Snow fell in earnest on November 9th. Not much the first day. A dry sift that settled into the needle duff and made the roofs look newly drawn. I spent the morning at the old lodge cleaning a blocked flue over the dining room hearth, while the owner, who had 3 bookings left and all of them canceled by noon, listened to the radio with his head tipped. Around 2, the power blinked twice. At 4, the village went blue with evening, and every house came up room by room. Except the Rains house came up all at once. I remember that because I was walking back from the hall with a coil of stove gasket over my shoulder and stopped in the road to look. All 6 front windows, the porch lamp, the upstairs landing, and the greenhouse lantern besides. Warm yellow against new snow. Almost festive. Except nothing else was. "Looks like a wedding," May said beside me. I hadn't heard her come up. "It does." She watched a moment longer, then went on. That night, Aaron didn't come home. I only learned that the next morning when I drove up to the Rains place because Helen had sent word the mudroom stove was back smoking again in east wind. Paul met me on the porch, still in his coat. "Can't do it today," he said. "All right." "We're expecting Aaron." He said the name as if that explained the weather. I offered to come back tomorrow. He nodded but didn't move aside. Behind him I could see the hallway lit bright in daytime, lamps still on though the sun was up. Helen crossed from one room to another, carrying folded towels she wasn't really looking at. I drove away, feeling the kind of unease that doesn't have an object yet. Aaron arrived that evening on a borrowed snowmobile just before full dark. Not alone. There was a second sled behind him, tethered by rope, and on it a plastic cargo sled piled with blankets and 2 fuel cans. Tomas later told me Aaron had been found 2 miles below the pass where the lower road split, riding one-handed and barely upright. He'd been trying to bring medicine up from Talcott. There had been something at a gas station, then at the clinic, then on the road out. He didn't tell it straight. None of them did after the first day or 2. People report trauma in fragments because sequence implies control. What mattered was this. He had a bite high on his forearm under 2 layers of tape, and Nora said she had never seen anyone with that kind of fever still standing. They took him to the clinic room in the hall first because it was warm and near supplies. Helen stayed. Paul paced outside in snow that squeaked from cold. Tomas asked me to keep the school stove going because families were waiting there while Nora worked. By midnight, people knew enough. Nora came out pale and exhausted and told the room what she could say without causing a scene. Bite transmission appeared consistent. High fever, rapid deterioration, death, then activity. She used careful terms, but not gentle ones. She said if Aaron died indoors, he could not remain there. She said the body would need immediate handling. She said she was sorry. I did not see what happened in the clinic room. I'm glad of that. In memory, some things stay more human by remaining partially shut behind a door. What I know is this. Aaron died before dawn. Sometime after that, there was shouting in the corridor, then a crash, then the kind of silence that means everyone present has begun doing something unpleasant on purpose. By first light, he was no longer in the hall. For the next 3 days, no one mentioned him directly, though people talked around the shape of the event. Helen stayed home. Paul came into the village once for paraffin and heavy gloves. Nora slept 15 hours, and then got up and reorganized the clinic shelves as if tiredness could be filed. Tomas put fresh latches on the lower hall doors. The radio offered less information than rumor, and rumor offered less than the weather. I kept working, because if you stop using your hands entirely, thinking rushes in. On the 4th evening, I was splitting kindling behind the store when I saw movement uphill near the Rains orchard. Too large for deer. Too slow for a living person in that cold. It passed behind the trees and vanished. I knew then. Or knew enough. That same night, the lights at the Rains house stayed on until nearly dawn. The village made room for grief in a very particular way. Nobody said Helen and Paul were right to do what they were doing. Nobody said they were wrong either. Not where they could be overheard. What happened instead was a kind of coordinated not naming. Someone took them kerosene. Someone else brought split wood too dry for their own stove to like. May sent bread and pretended it was because Helen had paid in advance for winter baking last month. Tomas checked the branch line to their house twice and said only that he wanted the load balanced. Nora walked up there every second day with a canvas bag and came back with it lighter. I was asked to go in late November because the upstairs hall light had started flickering, and Paul wanted to know if it was the fixture or the line. "Do they want you?" Tomas asked. Paul did. "That's enough." The snow was calf-deep on the unshoveled part of the path. Someone had tamped a narrow track from porch to woodshed, another to the greenhouse, and a third farther out toward the old deer fence. Not random. Repeated. The sort of track made by necessity over several days. Helen let me in. She looked composed in the way of people who have passed through the public stage of fear and are now doing private work that leaves no energy for display. The house was warmer than before, overlit too. Lamps in corners, sconces on at noon. The white curtains glowed softly. There was a kettle on, soup in a pot, boots drying by the stove, and beneath all that, an atmosphere I can only call concentrated, as if the whole house had agreed to keep itself together by force of habit. Paul showed me the upstairs fixture. Loose contact, nothing worse. While I worked on the landing, I could see down the hall to a back bedroom with the door shut and a chair placed under the knob. Not theatrically, practically. I remember noticing the chair legs had towels wrapped around them to protect the floor. From outside, faintly, came the crunch of slow steps and snow. I paused without meaning to. Helen, at the bottom of the stairs, looked up at me. Not embarrassed, just tired of deciding whether to explain things. "He comes to the porch after dark," she said. I didn't answer. "He doesn't like the house black." There are responses a person imagines himself giving to sentences like that. Rational, moral, clarifying. I gave none of them. I tightened the contact screw, restored the globe, and tested the switch. The light burned steadily. "Do you need anything else?" I asked. Helen thought for a moment. "Can you make the sitting room stove run lower without going out? It gets too hot if we keep it on all night." So I spent the next hour adjusting draft and showing Paul how to bank the fire deeper against the back of the box. We talked about coal bed management and gasket leak, as if that were the whole of the afternoon. When I left, I carried with me not horror exactly, but a feeling I still have trouble placing. It was something like the moment you understand that another household has built its daily life around an impossible fact, and, because they have done so with enough patience, the impossible fact has become furniture. The winter that followed was not one long emergency. It was weather, chores, shortages, silence, occasional fear, and the ordinary persistence of meals. That matters. People imagine collapse as acceleration. Often it is the opposite. Systems thin out. Travel takes longer. Decisions made badly in town now take weeks to arrive as consequences. The mountain amplifies this. After the second heavy snow, the pass became sporadic. After the third, not worth discussing. We had radio contact some days with Talcott, and less often with the county seat. There were shelters down there, we were told, and armed checkpoints, and schools converted into wards, and neighborhoods that had simply gone dark. We were also told to remain where we were if we had heat, water, and food for 6 weeks. That is not advice so much as a sorting mechanism. The village entered winter by existing more deliberately. We stopped assuming the line power would hold through every storm. Tomas and Leah Brand, who had once run maintenance for the old lodge, set a rotation for backup generation at the hall and clinic. Families with good wells filled jugs for those on shallow lines. The school met in 2 rooms only, then later not at all, once parents began teaching from copied packets. May turned the bakery ovens on every second day to conserve fuel, and because bread is easier to distribute if everyone expects it. I cleaned stoves, reseated pipe, taught 3 people how to recognize creosote they should worry about, and creosote they only needed to note. At some point I stopped thinking of myself as a contractor and started thinking of myself as one of the village's winter tools. Not important, just present and suited to task. At night, the basin held sound strangely. Snow does that, absorbs some things, carries others. You could hear a shovel half a mile away if the air was still. You could hear the faint generator hum from the hall on outage nights, and, sometimes, the old freight trucks laboring on the distant highway long after any sensible freight company would have suspended routes. Once or twice we heard shots far down valley. More often it was nothing, and the occasional bark of a fox. And every night the Rains house stayed lit. It changed how I read the village. There was the co-op glow low in the center, modest and amber. The hall on meeting nights or clinic hours. Here and there a single kitchen square. Then above them, that steady warmth on the bench, too bright to ignore and too human to resent cleanly. I began going up there more often than work strictly required. Sometimes to check the parlor stove, sometimes to replace a lamp mantle, or bring a length of gasket rope, or fix a hinge that had begun binding from dry cold. Sometimes because May handed me a loaf and said, "Take that up when you go," in a tone that implied my route had already been decided. Paul would meet me on the porch if he heard the truck. Helen often had music on very low, records at first, then a battery radio when the turntable belt gave out. They kept to a schedule. Breakfast by the stove. Lamps cleaned after lunch. Curtains drawn before full dark. One upstairs window opened briefly each morning to air the hall, no matter the temperature. The dog slept through all of it until January, when he died quietly under the bench outside, and Paul buried him near the greenhouse with the ground half frozen. Aaron was never discussed in the past tense. He was not discussed in the present tense either. Not exactly. Helen would say, "He's been by the north side tonight," or "He doesn't like wind," or "He walked the orchard twice." Paul would say less. But once, while we were carrying wood in, he asked whether I thought light made a difference to people with memory loss. "My mother used to sundown," he said, "when she was in the last year of it. If the room got dark too quickly, she'd pace." I stood there holding an armload of split fur, and understood that he was not asking a medical question. "I think familiar things can matter after other things go," I said. He nodded once, as if that settled enough. The closest I came to Aaron that winter was on a night in mid-December, when I stayed too long at the Rains' place finishing a repair on the greenhouse door. By the time I stepped out, full dark had taken the orchard. The house behind me was golden through curtains. Snow grains hissed against the hood of my coat. As I rounded the corner by the porch, I saw a shape standing just beyond the shoveled path near the fence line, not lunging, not hidden, simply there. For one instant my mind did what minds do, and tried to make the figure ordinary. A man waiting. Paul taking something out back. A neighbor. Then I understood from posture alone that whatever organized ordinary waiting was absent. The shoulders hung wrong. The head tipped as if listening without ears. I stopped. The figure did not come forward. It turned slightly toward the house. The porch lamp laid a weak yellow edge along one sleeve, and I saw the fabric frozen stiff at the forearm where blood had once dried. Inside, Helen crossed the front room carrying something, a blanket maybe, and the curtain shifted. The figure moved half a step toward the light, then no more. I backed to the truck without turning my back on it, started the engine, and drove down in four-wheel low because my hands were not behaving at full intelligence. I did not sleep much that night. The stove overfired because I forgot to close the draft all the way, and I had to get up at 2 to settle it. Through the room's small window, I could see the upper bench. The Rains' house glowed steadily, patient as a station lamp. In January, the cold sharpened. There are different mountain colds. Wet cold that enters through cuffs and wants company. Dry cold that turns breath to dust and makes wood crack in the stack. January that year was the second kind. The kind that finds the small errors in houses, the missing weather strip, the thin pane, the nail hole behind trim, and turns them into drafts with personalities. It was also when the fuel problem stopped being abstract. By Christmas, we knew the tanker from Talcott wasn't coming again soon. Propane had become contingency only. Diesel for the backup generator was measured and logged. Kerosene, which had seemed plentiful in October, because half the village still used oil lamps out of habit, started to thin once people realized habit and necessity were converging. The council, though that made it sound more formal than it was, met at the hall one evening to talk through rationing. I was there because anything involving heat eventually drifted my way. People sat in folding chairs and coats, steam rising faintly from boots. Nora had a ledger. Tomas had load estimates for the branch lines. May had brought tea in a stock pot and paper cups. Everyone looked tired in the particular clean-edged way cold produces. The Rains house came up 20 minutes in. Not by name, by numbers first. Average evening load on that branch. Lamp oil use by household. Wood requests exceeding expected burn rate for square footage. People talked carefully around it, but not forever. Leah said, "We need some kind of fairness." May said, "Fairness and sameness aren't the same thing." A man from the lower chalets, whose wife was down valley and maybe alive and maybe not, said he didn't see why one house needed to glow like a hotel while the rest of us sat in one room. No one answered him immediately. That was the hardest part of that winter for me, I think. Not fear. The pauses. The village was full of people decent enough to understand one another and strained enough to resent the understanding. Finally, Tomas asked me, because I was there, and because technical questions often get used to approach emotional ones sideways, whether there was a way to reduce visible light at the Rains place without leaving them in dark. I knew what he was actually asking. Not about lumens, about whether the ritual could be kept while the cost was lowered. I could improve the reflectors, I said. Move them to lower watt bulbs where there are still bulbs to move. Use mirrors, white shades. Get more out of less. Would it still look lit from outside? May asked. Probably only she and I understood why that was the right question. Yes, I said. It would. So that became my January project. I went up with a box of salvaged fixtures from the lodge, 2 old barbershop mirrors someone had in storage, white enamel shades, foil-faced insulation scrap, and more care than the work strictly required. Helen watched me line the inside of lamp hoods and angle light toward curtains instead of ceilings. Paul helped mount a reflector behind the hall sconce. We swapped the porch bulb for a lower draw and cleaned the grime from the fixture glass to compensate. I set the parlor stove to hold longer overnight so they could kill 1 electric heater in the back room. It was the most delicate efficiency job I ever did. When I was done, the house looked no dimmer from the road. If anything, it looked warmer. The light spread better, less harsh and more domestic, as if I had not reduced a burden, but improved a home. Helen stood beside me at dusk while we checked the effect from the orchard gate. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not insisting on the exact name of things." I did not know what to do with that, so I watched the windows come up one by one and kept my hands in my pockets. The dead remained mostly outside our daily routines, which may be why the routines held. That sounds colder than I mean it. What I'm saying is the village did not survive by heroics. It survived by keeping thresholds legible. Daylight for movement. Paired travel above the school road. Doors latched even when carrying wood in. No unnecessary noise after dusk. If someone failed to return by full dark, you did not go wandering for them. You waited until first light with 2 others and a clear route. People lower down may have had other rules. Ours were mountain rules, translated into a new dialect. Now and then, the dead came near enough to remind us of themselves. A skier in a red shell found standing against a drift near the water tank, 1 glove missing. A woman from Talcott recognized by May from the feed store, moving slowly along the road as if still trying to remember why she'd come. 2 men on snowshoes heard below the quarry at dawn, their poles ticking against stone in an unnerving rhythm long after their bodies should have been tired. We handled those situations when we had to, and we didn't talk much about them after. There was no useful vocabulary for prolonged wrongness. People revert to tasks. By February, the basin had narrowed into winter proper. Days bright and brittle, nights so clear the stars felt metallic. I spent a week helping Leah thaw a frozen line to the school kitchen, and another repairing a stovepipe elbow in one of the summer cabins, where an elderly man had decided he'd rather freeze than move in with his sister. May bruised 2 fingers chopping kindling and hit it badly. Nora finally allowed herself one full afternoon off and slept on a cot near the clinic stove, while half the village pretended not to notice. At the Rains' house, the lights still came on in sequence. Something in me had gotten used to that. More than used to it, maybe. Oriented by it. In a winter where almost everything beyond the basin had become rumor, that lit house was a fact. Not a good fact. Not a safe one, but a steady one. Then came the thaw week. Just a false thaw, really. 3 days of warmer air in late February that turned the snowskin loose and set the eaves dripping. The road went from white to gray slush and back again at night. Everyone knew that kind of thaw was dangerous. It altered surfaces without changing underlying conditions. You trusted it at your expense. On the second evening of it, Paul came down to find me at the hall. He had no hat on. His hair was flattened on one side as if he'd been lying down and then changed his mind. He stood in the doorway while wind pushed wet cold around his boots. "Helen needs Nora," he said. Nora was already on her feet. We went up together, the 3 of us, with a med bag and 2 lanterns, because the branch line had tripped for a minute, and nobody wanted to rely on it. The path was slick. Snow had slid in one sheet off the greenhouse and lay frozen across the yard like a broken window. Inside, the house was warm, but wrong. Not in a supernatural sense. In the ordinary human way, houses go wrong when one person has been carrying too much of the weight that keeps them ordinary. Helen was at the kitchen table coughing into a dish towel. Nothing dramatic. No fever from a bite. No crisis with the dead. Pneumonia, probably, or the beginning of it. Exhaustion, certainly. Months of too little sleep and too much vigilance had thinned her down to the structure. While Nora listened to her lungs, Paul stood at the counter and looked at nothing. I ended up relighting the mudroom stove because it had gone low, and the draft had turned. Then I checked the hall lamps, though nobody asked me to. Habit more than need. When Nora said Helen should spend at least 2 nights at the hall where people could watch her, Helen shook her head so firmly it set off another coughing fit. "I'm not leaving the house dark," she said when she could speak. "We can light it," Nora told her. "You won't light it right." There was a silence after that. Not offended, just tired. Paul rubbed a hand over his mouth. "Maybe it's time," he said. Helen looked at him in a way that made me feel suddenly intrusive in the room. "Not while there's snow," she said. "Maybe because there's snow." She turned her eyes from him then and looked at me instead, perhaps because I was the least entitled person present and therefore somehow safest. "Would you shut the backdraft if we went down to the hall?" she asked. "It whistles if no one listens to it." It was such a house-shaped question that it nearly undid me. "I can," I said. In the end, she agreed to spend the night at the hall, only if Paul came back with me after dinner to set the lamps properly and make sure every curtain was drawn as usual. That is what we did. We moved through the house room by room under her instruction, though she was already halfway into the coat Nora had brought. Front room first, kitchen after the kettle boiled, hall lamp, mudroom last, porch left on. Before leaving, Paul stood in the entry with his hand on the jamb. From somewhere out in the wet dark beyond the orchard came a slow step, and another. Paul did not flinch. He only looked toward the sound and said, very quietly, "We'll be back in the morning." It was not a statement from me or Nora. That night I stayed awake in my room over the store long enough to see the Rains house burning on the hillside above the village, while its owners slept below for the first time in months. I don't know what I expected. Motion at the windows, dark shapes in the yard, some sign that the arrangement depended on a human witness. But the house simply kept shining, and the basin kept being winter around it. Helen recovered slowly, strong enough by the third day to be angry, which everyone took as a good sign. She went home before Nora liked it. After that, though, something had shifted. Not in her belief, if belief is the word. In her stamina, maybe. Or in Paul's. He came to find me in early March with a request that at first sounded mechanical. "Can you show me how to shut the upstairs off from the hall switch?" he asked. "Leave the front room and kitchen." "Sure." We went up together. Snow still lay deep in the orchard, but the edges had softened, and there was a new sound under everything. Water moving where it had been held. The dog's grave by the greenhouse had sunk slightly. A black line of roof slate showed on the south pitch. Inside, the house felt more spacious than it had in January. Not emptier, just less tightly wound. I rewired a switch and labeled a breaker. Paul watched closely, then tried it himself. Upstairs, dark. Downstairs, warm. Porch on. "That's good," he said. Helen brought tea. Her cough lingered but had gone shallow. She sat at the table looking out toward the yard. "We won't need the landing light much longer," she said. No one asked what had changed. I think I knew from tone alone that whatever winter bargain had existed was already loosening. Perhaps Aaron had stopped coming every night. Perhaps thaw altered him. Perhaps grief itself had changed phases the way snowpack does, dense enough in 1 month to hold weight, rotten the next. A few mornings later, Tomas and 2 others went up to the Rains place before dawn, with a sledge and a coil of chain in the truck bed. Nobody announced why. They came back after sunrise without the chain.